For any of you who have played through all of the main storylines in the Elder Scrolls games, you probably are intimately familiar with Mehrunes Dagon, Daedric Prince of Darkness and Destruction. As the main adversary of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, Mehrunes Dagon led a fearsome attack against not only Cyrodiil, but all of Tamriel at the end of the Third Era, where thousands of Oblivion gates opened across the continent and laid siege to the lands. Every race and province of Tamriel suffered greatly, outside of the Argonians who, under the guide of the Hiss trees, decimated the Daedra easily, at least according to one historian. And it goes without saying that because of this, Mehrunes Dagon is not only one of the most powerful of the princes, but also one of the most hated. He has a love for war and anger, and seems to be driven by nothing more than a desire for bloodshed of mortals, which carries over into his realm as well, the Deadlands. Funnily enough, we actually get to see a ton of this zone in the Elder Scrolls Oblivion. After all, many portions of the game will see you running inside Oblivion gates into the Deadlands in order to stop more Daedra from pouring through. The area itself is a never-ending sheet of volcanic rock, including an area known as the Burn, which is miles-long oceans of lava with small scorched islands and ruins dotted throughout. Near this as well is the Sever, another region in the Deadlands with light soil and jagged rocks, accompanied by molten hot sulfur pools that give birth to monstrous Daedra. And speaking of Daedra, while all different kinds can be found in the Deadlands, primarily those found here are Dremora, extremely warlike and bloodthirsty variants of their Daedric brothers who treat mortals with disdain and no empathy. Or in other words, trying to survive within the Deadlands would be a horrific fate, one full of nothing but pain and war non-stop, where absolutely every single creature wants to kill you and the environment swallows you whole. On top of this, natural disasters are commonplace in the Deadlands, with fierce winds, constant lightning storms, and gargantuan fiery tornadoes wreaking havoc wherever they go. If you did manage to somehow survive long enough in this place to hide inside one of the towers, you would be met with dilapidated and ruined ancient rooms, full of torture devices and skeletal remains of men and women slowly flayed alive as spikes tear at their innards. It's even been said that the screams of the souls of the damned can be heard here, forever moaning in agony, being washed away by the engines of change which Mehrunes Dagon watches over. Political strife is high in the zone as well, with many of the prince's war chiefs butting heads over even small matters, vying with one another for ultimate power and devotion to their lord. So all in all, we are talking about a zone where war and battle is happening non-stop. Everyone and everything is trying to kill you, and the lord of the realm itself is a sadistic murderer who wants nothing more than to kill everyone in his realm, along with everything outside of it, for that matter. In a lot of ways, it could be argued that Mehrunes Dagon has one of the worst planes of Oblivion that you could find yourself in. And the only reason I personally don't put him right at the top is that I think there are things much worse than a quick fiery death. Things that will torture our very minds and souls and cause terror the likes of which we could only imagine in nightmares. So while by no means I would be happy waking up in this hellscape as it has no redeeming qualities whatsoever, just wait until you see what's coming up at the end of this list. Most Daedric realms are terrifying because of their rulers, beings of madness, domination, and cruelty. So what would happen in a plane that has lost its prince? Welcome to Miramore, a forgotten plane of fate, shattered timelines, and broken memory. Once ruled by the Daedric Prince of Untraveled Roads, Botheia, now trapped in limbo, suspended between annihilation and rebirth. The zone itself is a large desert wasteland full of gargantuan skeletons and an auroral sky composed of millions of shattered mirrors and crystalline structures. The sky flickers wildly from time to time, sometimes revealing stars that do not exist and constellations that never were, leading to bouts of confusion and disillusion for many. And this ethereal chaos hints at the very fabric of reality being frayed, a constant, subtle reminder that the ground beneath one's feet could unmake itself at any moment. However, in its heyday, it would have been quite the otherworldly spectacle. But this heyday of sorts did not last long for one very specific reason. You see, Botheia, with her abilities to see time and fate, constantly was messing with reality and the natural order. at one point even creating a powerful fate-altering engine known as the Loom of the Untraveled Road. This Daedric engine had the ability to tap into the power of the many paths itself, a web of infinite alternate realities and outcomes within Arbus, essentially a multiverse. And Hermaeus Mora, the demon of knowledge, fearing what Athelia might rewrite, led a coalition of princes in a forbidden war, one that shattered Miramore and erased Athelia from memory itself. And this is the reason that so few people even know of her existence, and why in any game prior to 2024 she is never mentioned, owing to the fact that she was originally introduced in the Elder Scrolls Online Necrom and Gold Road DLCs, the newest prince we've seen in Elder Scrolls lore. Regardless though, now we can read about multiple areas where Athelia struggled to break from the chains of imprisonment, in the second era even almost managing to bring back Miramore fully. But up until this point, Fargrave remains as mostly the only thing to remember of this lost place. And this leaves us at an interesting junction. After all, as a plane of oblivion ruled over by no one, Fargrave's society and customs have become very different from most other Daedric realms. And because there is no prince, Fargrave serves as a breeding ground of sorts, a crossroads and stomping grounds between the mortal realms of Mundus and the more ethereal and twisted lands of Oblivion. Think of it almost like limbo or a trading post before a great city. Some poets in Cyrodiil even describe it as not a realm you visit, but a possibility you have chosen. This neutral existence is maintained by an ancient Daedric pact known as the Stricture, which guarantees that no Daedra can eat, kill, or torture one another or mortal races in the area. Instead, denizens here coexist with one another in somewhat harmony, mostly focusing on trade and commerce. It's by no means a vacation of any sorts. After all, mortals who stay in the lands of Fargrave for too long are afflicted with drain, an ailment which leads to madness and eventual death. But overall, the lack of any foreboding prince or insanity makes this a place that's quite manageable to stay in, especially due to the fact that the Daedra here are not allowed to kill. And while the skeletons and open desert wasteland of this zone carried over from Miramore would be depressing at times, at least you would constantly be seeing new mortals and Daedra pouring into the zone as a stopgap which you could talk to and get to know and learn about all of their history. A melting pot of cultures and ideas that would honestly be super fascinating in a way. Even going here in Elder Scrolls Online, for example, is an awesome experience, getting to see the remnants of an ancient prince's land full of so many fascinating characters you could find nowhere else. However, there will always be the looming threat of Athelia coming back and changing fate itself, destroying Fargrave and contorting it once again into her plane of Miramore, likely destroying all those inside in the process. Imagine living in a temporary sanctuary, knowing that one's very existence is on borrowed time, perpetually threatened by the reawakening of a prince whose power could rewrite entire histories out of existence. A ticking clock of forgotten doom, but one that would probably be one of the best places to live in Oblivion in the meantime. Known simply as the Queen of Dawn and Dusk, Azora from the Elder Scrolls is a holy figure who promises love and beauty to those who follow her. In many texts, she is described as the most fair and benevolent of the Daedric princes, a woman who can be thought of more as a jealous lover than anything outright nefarious. In fact, by many accounts, her realm is in theory a net benefit for those who come, the only plane of Oblivion on this list that can claim that title. For example, we have multiple first-hand books from the games that explain this explicitly, like this excerpt from author Sagalia Parate. Molag Bal wanted my mind, Botheia wanted my arms, and Nocturnal perhaps my curiosity. Azora wants all of that, and our love above all, not our abject slavering, but our honest and genuine caring in all its forms. It is important to her that our emotions be engaged in her worship, and our love must also be directed inward. If we love her and hate ourselves, she feels our pain. But while this all sounds great on the surface, in a world full of monsters and madness, the question then becomes, how trustworthy is a god who asks not for your soul, but your heart? Maybe Azora is hiding something more sinister behind this lovable veil, and our best indication of that might be her utopian playground, Moonshadow. Described as a realm of oblivion that holds so much beauty that it renders its inhabitants partially blind, Moonshadow is an idyllic wonderland of fragrant flowers, towering waterfalls, pink trees, and a massive city adorned in wonderful silver. Animals walk in the plains in groups of thousands, sipping from pristine bodies of water while butterflies fill the air for as far as the eye can see. And really, at least on the surface, this realm of oblivion sounds more like a vacation than anything evil. In fact, Azora herself is described as watching over Moonshadow within her ever-changing Rose Palace, welcoming all mortal travelers with open arms. But the more we dig into this description of Moonshadow, the more concerning things become, even in what clearly is the best place to live in terms of Daedric realms. For instance, what exactly is it that is blinding people who enter this place? We know by all accounts that this realm would be breathtaking, but other Daedric princes also have alluring landscapes, even more so than Azora's, and the inhabitants seem to live normal lives in these regardless. Maybe this blinding effect, as described in ancient texts, isn't just a punishment for disloyalty, but an inherent consequence of prolonged exposure to Moonshadow's overwhelming splendor. A sensory overload designed to break the mind rather than soothe it. Azora's love might not be a benevolent gift, but rather a perpetual test of absolute devotion, where conditional affection and control become an insidious form of horror. This demanding love, more than any overt malice, reveals the true cost of paradise under the Twilight Queen. And while most mortals on Nirn would argue that this isn't the case, since Azora is seen as one of the good Daedra, there are also some factions amongst the Dunmer who have begun to question her intentions. Rumors in parts of Tamriel have spread that Azora has even allied herself with Molag Bal, one of the most twisted and evil of the Daedric princes who loves to torture humans slowly as they beg for mercy. If there is any truth in these discussions, it could be that Azora's House of Blinding Beauty actually more closely matches its name, Moonshadow, a place that is adorned in darkness and evil beneath the light cast by the moon. We get clues to this as well in some sparse texts, like a note found in the Elder Scrolls Online called Notes on the Doors of Oblivion, which states the following: Moonshadow isn't beautiful. It's like crying a painting, and there's only so much oil in the eye a person can stand before they want to tear everything out of their head and be done with it. It's a fascinating idea for sure, and shows us that even the most beloved and seemingly kind-hearted of the Daedra hide dark secrets as to what's really going on. And also how many different accounts of each place in the Elder Scrolls there are, making true accuracy that much harder, but also making things feel a lot more grounded and real. But still, if we go by most historical records and religious teachings in the modern Elder Scrolls titles, Azora and her realm of Moonshadow is about the best place you could find yourself in Oblivion, worshipped by man, Myr, and Khajiit alike as a shrine between Nirn and the afterlife, a place watched over by a mother filled with love. For the Dunmer, it is taught that she gave their people vision that saved them from the calamity at Vardenfell, and for the Khajiit, she is credited as introducing their race to moonsugar, which helped them reach new economic heights during struggle. So as to how bad Moonshadows would be to live in, well, it's hard to say. On one hand, it sounds like a beautiful paradise, but on the other, it might just be a jail cell that followers are being tricked into. And in a way, what could be worse than that? Being forced into a living fake utopian life where all is good until the moment you decide to not fully love its creator and you are blinded and secretly sent to Molag Bal. Regardless, based on what we know about upcoming Daedric princes and their realms on this list, I think Moonshadows is still without a doubt the place I would most want to take a gamble on, especially since Azora is considered to be the most well-behaved of the lords. In a pantheon of such insanity and cruelty, you'd think every Daedric realm of Oblivion would be depressing. But in the case of the Shivering Isles, domain of the Lord of Madness Shaogath, it's entertainment. A place that can drive you utterly insane, but will keep you laughing while it happens. We know this because out of every Daedric prince in their realm, the Shivering Isles are the most well understood, owing to the fact that the best DLC Bethesda has ever made, The Shivering Isles for the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, includes dozens of hours of content centered around nothing but the realm of madness, mania, and dementia. Shaogath himself, though, did not always preside over this area, as before he was even Shaogath himself, he was known by a different name, Jiggalag, the Daedric Prince of Order. Many years before the dawn of the First Era, Jiggalag was the most powerful of the Daedric princes, a deity which controlled large portions of Oblivion all to himself, at the center of which laid a statistician's library which could predict all possible futures and actions using precise and advanced mathematics. The other Daedric princes grew jealous of this grand power and sought to end Jiggallag's long reign. Through an assortment of tricks and struggles, they eventually managed to do this, resulting in what we now know as the Grey March, where Jiggalag was transformed into what he hates most, a new Daedric prince called Shaogath who dabbled in madness and chaos rather than order. At the end of each era, Shaogath is cursed once again to be reborn as Jiggalag, after which for a short time this alternate personality tears apart the Shivering Isles, followed by Shaogath assuming the body once again where he must rebuild. It means an already insane plane of Oblivion becomes even more threatening because of the power struggle between a bipolar prince and his never-ending curse, battling between order and chaos within one mind. But what does this mean for the Shivering Isles themselves? What would it be like to live there? Well, despite that the realm is constantly changing, we know from the Shivering Isles DLC, as well as tons of in-game lore, that it would be like living in an insane asylum for eternity. The realm itself, at least how we see it in the Third Era, is one giant island surrounded by multiple seas that is split up into two distinct arenas. The northern portion is known as Mania, where we see a more lighthearted and happy view of Shaogath, with multiple valleys of expansive grasslands and mushroom forests that give way to bustling villages full of manic people screaming in happiness and joy, looking to the stars with glee. It's a beautiful, albeit somewhat unsettling place, where you feel nothing but joy while knowing a sinister undertone lies beneath the surface. In the south, we find the complete opposite, the zones of dementia, showing the harder and darker sides of Shaogath, consisting primarily of one large swamp full of dead and dying flora and fauna. This area is characterized by a much more mature tone, showing endless torture and anger, with towns inhabited by much more hostile denizens who will either kill you on sight or seek to harm you in any way possible while you sleep. It's obviously the worst of the two zones on the face of it, but what makes the Shivering Isles is the madness of trying to live between both. Even the capital city of the realm, New Shaoth, is divided across these lines, with its manic side being known as Bliss and its demented, the Crucible, where people on both sides are split and completely different and yet must interact between one another on a daily basis, all in an attempt to reflect the mind of Shaogath himself, who in one moment will be cracking jokes about something he saw, and the next kidnapping and torturing butterflies in sadistic rituals, sometimes turning to human beings when he gets bored. And really, boredom is a lot of what Shaogath is afraid of. The Shivering Isles themselves are designed from the ground up to be the complete opposite of normal, opting to always keep you on your toes with insane things to find, and only for brief glimpses at the end of eras do we get to see Jiggalag come forth yet again and bring order for a brief period. So essentially, living in the Shivering Isles would be a constantly shifting battle to stay sane, in a world that is doing everything possible to make you go crazy with madness. It's a terrifying way of life for sure, but honestly speaking, compared to almost every other plane of Oblivion ruled by a Daedric prince, it wouldn't be all that bad. First of all, technically speaking, at the end of the Shivering Isles DLC, we as the player assume the role of Shaogath after destroying Jiggalag and breaking their curse. But because I'm not a fan of how Bethesda makes you easily the most powerful part of every faction you join in every game, and how this makes ranking the realm impossible since it would depend on the role-playing of each character, we are just going to keep looking at this from the perspective of being inside this realm when the real Shaogath still rules. But furthermore, living here might actually be quite interesting too. as the Shivering Isles has a robust political system, where both mania and dementia are treated as duchies with their own duke or duchess who has a say in new rules and laws. And speaking of law, being arrested in the Shivering Isles is very similar to imperial-owned lands in Mundus, where usually you will be hit with an appropriate fine or jail time, only being killed if you resist heavily against Shaogath and his rule. Compared to the treatment we will find in many of the other realms, living in the Shivering Isles in many ways would be a cakewalk. And if you manage to make your way to the northern half of Mania, despite how annoying or weird it could be at times, you at least could live a relatively good life, with your main struggle being trying not to lose your mind. In fact, there are multiple towns and groups of people in the north specifically that do worship other Daedric princes, and they're still left to be alive, showing that Shaogath is too trapped within the madness of his own mind to watch over his realm too closely. And all in all, it's crazy to think that this mad prince with bipolar-like symptoms was before exactly the opposite, an all-powerful being hell-bent on order and eradication of chaos, only to be transformed into the very thing he hated. But it does mean for us that if we were forced to live in a place in the Plains of Oblivion, the Shivering Isles might be one of the best picks. After all, worst case, if Shaogath did decide to torture you, he probably would crack some good jokes in between. Like the time he forced a hero to slay a powerful Daedra with the Fork of Horripilation, a useless rusty utensil which barely left a mark, or what about the famous Wabbajack? Maybe the coolest weapon in Skyrim, which is a staff that casts a random effect every time you use it, including transforming the target into a chicken. That was Shaogath, and I bet he has a lot more where that came from. As you would have likely immediately guessed based on the name, Boethia's Plane of Oblivion, Attribution Share, is all about the idea of power divided. The realm itself is a dizzying labyrinth of maze gardens and twisting hallways, with giant towers scattered throughout which hold groups of mortals and spirits alike. The entire zone is dedicated to the idea of every individual having full rights and freedom, but this freedom comes at a cost. As the Prince of Deceit and Plots, Boethia pushes all of her denizens towards inevitable conflict and betrayal, by seeding rumors and putting out only enough things for a select few individuals to have. Watching as people fight for resources and power, all in a never-ending struggle to crawl their way to the top. Essentially how people in late-stage capitalism think of our modern day. Because of this, it's a very politically motivated and tense realm, full of dozens of notable factions and gangs that jockey for control at different parts of the labyrinth. The plane even used to be named after this constant battle of wits and deception, previously known as the Snake's Mount, before it was renamed to Attribution Share. But regardless of what we choose to call it, finding yourself in any subplane of this place would be a living nightmare. Everyone you meet, every group you speak with, is out for themselves, with political turmoil at all-time highs and no one being able to agree on who should have power, with constant murders taking place of high-ranking officials who have outstayed their welcome. On top of this too, Boethia is described by almost all the Tamrielic races, regardless of their religious teachings, as one of the most powerful of the Daedric princes, a being who is unbelievably cold and impersonal, seeking only to watch her followers fight on her behalf. For example, she hosts frequent arena tournaments in her subdomain called Boethia Stadium, which looks very similar to the Deadlands, but with even more terrifying volcanic eruptions non-stop. Every year, she invites a different person from each race found in Tamriel and has them fight in this stadium in one-on-one duels to the death, until one is able to best the other, with the final victor receiving the prize, drinking from the blood of those slain. All in all, it's a horrifying existence, being trapped in a place that not only has pockets as bad as the Deadlands, but with the extra pressure of knowing that every moment your future will be steeped in deadly political gridlock. No one can be trusted, as everyone can only look out for themselves. Some texts from ancient scholars even describe situations where entire families have been torn apart by Attribution Share, turning mothers against their offspring and siblings against one another. Because to survive an Attribution Share means to sacrifice part of your humanity, instead conforming yourself to the will of Boethia and deceiving and murdering in her favor. If there was any consolation though, if you're already a horrible person, you might do quite well here, being able to trick those around you into following your lead and getting rid of them when the moment called for whatever reason. Or in other words, Attribution Share isn't a realm for the faint of heart or those who want friends. It's for the most ruthless among us, who will do whatever it takes to reach the top, even if it means throwing their family and friends into the volcanic pits of the arena, or trapping them in a never-ending maze while you use their possessions for political gain, forcing anyone who enters to become the monster that lives inside all of us just to survive. Initially, if you were to find yourself in the Fields of Regret, one of the most seemingly scenic plains of Oblivion, you might think you've reached paradise. Because within the fields are rolling green hills with bewitching vistas and countryside, scenic blue skies, and apple blossom trees for miles. By all accounts, on the surface, it is heavenly, and we see this depicted in the Elder Scrolls Redguard game perfectly, where even with the low polygon graphics and textures, it's a reminder of an almost Super Mario 64-like world with striking colors and sounds. However, it's when we remember again that the Daedric prince of this realm, Clavicus Vile, is the lord of trickery and bargains, that we realize there might be more to this twisted place than meets the eye. For instance, while on the surface the Fields of Regret are stunning, if you linger for too long, you will become acutely aware of the stink of rotting flesh and bone, unable to ever locate exactly where it's coming from. Because beneath what we see in this world is a rotten core, full of thieves, gangs, and liars who seek to trick and manipulate one another in service to their lord. Clavicus himself, ironically though, describes his demeanor as happy and carefree, liking to spend most of his time with his pet hound Barbas, who is a shape-shifting Daedra rumored to house half of Clavicus's power within, meaning Clavicus Vile himself may be a strange amalgamation of multiple beings. Regardless though, we still know very little about the actual Fields of Regret themselves, outside of the fact that they look nice and smell horrible. Some Elder Scrolls scholars have told tales of otherworldly things happening within this pocket plane of existence, but maybe our best guesses at what life would be like inside come from the city of Umbriel. Unknown by most Elder Scrolls fans due to the fact that it is only explored in depth in the books, Umbriel was originally a massive floating island found deep within the Fields of Regret, that around 50 years after the Oblivion Crisis was summoned into the Black Marsh, after which it floated all the way to the Imperial City. Outside of the fact that it's insane we don't hear more people talk about this constantly in Skyrim, the actual city itself is even crazier. Its inhabitants, known as Umbriellans, look very similar to other races found in Tamriel, but all only live lives between 10 to 15 years. When a person in Umbriel dies, they are reborn again from the water lake known as the Sump, a primordial soup of sorts filled with infused souls, who are born again into new bodies with no memory of their past lives. Despite how much this setup reminds me of the Pillars of Eternity series, one of the most fascinating in game's history, it also most likely sheds light into how different life must be in the Fields of Regret, a place where worm-like creatures with soul magic can consume the essence of entire people and birth them into something new. But also a location that most likely would be much more sinister than it lets on, where behind the cotton candy clouds and scenes that look like they are drawn from a painting, once again lies the Lord of Trickery, who has been known to find normal life boring, instead opting to put mortal beings in packs with consequences they can never foresee. It's by no means a horrible existence, especially considering some of the other planes of Oblivion we will be looking into here shortly, but I personally would be very concerned with how little we actually know, especially when we take into account multiple mortals' records of Clavicus Vile describing how much glee he gets in hurting people. In fact, one thing I didn't mention about Umbriel is that it was originally constructed and maintained by Umbra in order to protect against the powers of Clavicus Vile, meaning a huge cohort of people came together and risked everything just on the off chance they could be shielded from the wrath of this place. So while the Fields of Regret are yet another location we have yet to really see or hear much about in any sort of depth in the Elder Scrolls, if I was a betting man, I would say it probably is much worse than many Tamrielic scholars throughout the 4 modern eras are letting on.